and then it lets you know. So, say stuff that you don't want being recorded. All right. So I want to talk a little bit about, and I'm using slides just because it's an easy way for me to be able to kind of like keep track of what I'm talking about. But this is in no means like hey, you have to kind of sit quietly and listen to what I have to say. Like if you have questions at all as we're kind of talking through this, I just want to talk a little bit about developing an introduction, right? Because that's what we're doing this week. By Sunday, I'd like to see like a draft of your introduction for your paper. And really when we go through the writing process, the writing process is a process that's recursive, right? And that means that it's just something that we constantly go back to. And I think about like the writing process a lot like, I don't know, being in shape or exercising, for example. It's not like it's something that all of a sudden you say, okay, I'm in shape and now I don't need to do this anymore, right? It's one of those things that's recursive. It's you're constantly going back to it. And so the writing process is something that's that way, where it's right now we're talking about introduction, but we're going to be talking about introduction in week 14, for example. You'll be talking about writing introductions when you're taking English 2 or English 4. So it's not like, hey, we talk about introduction today and now we never talk about it again, right? It's we're constantly going back to it. And the same could be said of any piece of the essay, whether it's a thesis statement, quote integration, if it's, how to write a conclusion, right? Like these are all part of this recursive writing process. So just because we're talking about intro today does not mean that now I say, hey, well, we talked about intro, you should have this mastered. So next week, I don't want to talk about introduction again, right? That couldn't be further from the truth. So think about it the same thing, like, if you play a sport, for example, like, I don't know, my kids before everything shut down played soccer, right? And so like they would work on practicing passing a soccer ball. And even if you're a professional, you would still work on the same thing. So just know that like, yeah, we're talking about this today, but this is something that we're going to be talking about in weeks to come, and you'll be talking about it in future classes to come, right? So one of the things is that we're going to be focusing again on this recursive writing process and these individual multiple times throughout the semester. Also, I like to chunk up pieces of an essay. I think it makes sense, especially in an online context. Like one of the things, when we're face-to-face in classes, that I can kind of check in with people a lot easier, right? Just to be able to say like, hey, how's the writing process coming? Let me see where you are. It's easy for me to do a little bit more intervention, because when we're teaching, normally on campus, my office is just right down the hallway from where I'm teaching the class. And it's just an easy way for me to kind of check in with people, be able to help as much as possible. Online, that's a little bit more difficult to do. And also, this is not a synchronous class, right? So these kind of video mini lessons are just an extra bonus. They're never required. It's just something that it's nice to be able to see that there's human beings on the other side of the computer that I get to interact with, because my favorite part about teaching is that human to human relationships that we build, that moment of like learning things collaboratively in a classroom. And that's really tough not having that. So when we go through writing, I'll be breaking it up into different pieces, right? So a lot of times I like to have like little checkpoints along the way, like, hey, let's work on the introduction for this week. Next week, we're gonna be working on putting together your body paragraphs and then kind of finalizing it together. In future essays, we'll talk about writing concluding paragraphs, things like that. So I think it makes more sense to just like break it up into little pieces than it does for me to just say, here's the assignment, turn it in 2 weeks, right? And typically when I give writing assignments, I will break them up into all of those pieces, and we'll be in an essay cycle for somewhere around 2 to 3 weeks, depending on how big the essay is, especially when we get to the research project. That one's substantially bigger. So, just know that I'll be giving you little assignments, and even things like this week's discussion, just like the brainstorming, those are all individual pieces of the writing process, right? Like I like to think about it as there's a kind of a strategy of teaching it this way, which is called backwards design, which is like, we think about what the goal is, right? The goal is that we want to write this assignment. The goal is that, when we move into our next essays, that we're writing an essay about an issue, we're using readings to be able to back it up, right? And that everything that we do ahead of that are tasks that are going to be able to help with that larger goal, right? I know the movie's a little bit old, right? But I'm a little bit old. So, but like, do people know The Karate Kid? Have you seen that movie before? And if you haven't, then I'm going to add it onto Canvas as homework for you to do because it's one of my favorite movies, like growing up, right? But there's that part where like he makes Daniel do all the chores around the house, right? He's got to like wash the cars and sand the floor and do all that kind of stuff. And then when he like Daniel gets upset, he's like, I'm tired of doing your chores and I'm tired of washing your cars and I want to learn karate. And then Mr. Miyagi's like, all right, well, show me sand the floor and show me paint the fence. And he asks him to do all these things. And then like the whole time, like Daniel learned karate, right? And I'm not saying I'm Mr. Miyagi, but I'm not saying I'm Mr. Miyagi either, right? So like, I think the idea is that everything that he was doing was stuff that's going to help at the end goal so that he could go and win the karate tournament. But the same idea is true, right? Like if we do a discussion and we're talking about like how to be able to build ideas and just kind of even something as simple as just that little brainstorming that you do, that's an idea that's going to help you later on in an essay, right? If we're going through a reading and I'm having you, kind of brainstorm a little bit and have a discussion about an idea in an upcoming reading, those ideas, and the nice part about using the online discussions is it saves those conversations. So later on you could say, oh, I saw so-and-so had a really good comment about this reading and I might want to use this in my essay. Go back to it, look at it, and there might be something in there, an idea that you developed that you could use. I like to think of it as like little idea seeds, right? Like here's this idea that I developed somewhere in a discussion. I can go back, grab that idea and take it someplace in an essay. So it's all there for kind of like this greater purpose, and that greater purpose is the essays that we're working on. So I want to talk a little bit about introduction and developing and building context, right? Because that's what we're doing in introduction paragraphs. And then again, as we're kind of going through it, if you have any questions at all, just let me know, and we'll jump in and just kind of like have some discussions about this. Oh, I need to. Okay, so what do we already know about intro paragraphs? What are some things that you already know to be true about an intro paragraph?
That's where you're presenting the main idea for.
Yeah, right. So you're presenting your main idea for your essay. Good, absolutely. What else?
You give a few reasons why you chose.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Yeah, you could give some reasons why, and we'll talk about that as the semester goes on. I think it's one of those things where, for some people, they like the idea of presenting some reasons why. Other times they don't, and it really just depends. It's all preference, right? Sometimes you could say like, here's my argument, and then you could be like, and here's why I believe this to be true. Other times you could just say, here's my argument, and later in the essay it'll tell you why.
Oh, okay.
That's one of those things that's but it works perfectly, right? It's totally up to the writer.
Okay.
It just depends. Do you want to do it that way? Do you not want to do it that way? Right? I mean, it's kind of like if you have plans for the weekend, I don't know, like I don't really get to take my kids places anymore, right? Because we're stuck in the house. But like before we did, I'd be like, hey, we're going to go out for the day. Oh, where are we going to go? Oh, it's a surprise. Let's go. You'll see when we get there. Or I could say, we're going to go here, here, and there, and we're going to do A, B, and C, right? Like, so it really just depends. I saw someone in the chat wrote thesis, right? That's another thing that is part of an intro paragraph. So any other ideas? Any other things that come into an intro paragraph? Let's take a look and we'll talk through some of them. All right, so here's different things, and we'll kind of go through and talk about different features of an introduction. It hooks your reader's attention, right? Like that's something that your intro should also do. So I think about like, giving your reader a first impression, right? Like that's, just like in I don't know, in real life, we want to give people good first impressions. Or maybe if you're watching a new TV show, right? Like I know that now being home, right? Like I heard something, I was listening to a podcast earlier, and one of the actors from the TV show The Office was on there, and The Office is now like the most watched television show in the world, right? Like people watch it more than anything else. And he was saying that like that first day of shelter in place in March across the country, I think there was something absurd. Like in one day, it was like 25 million minutes of The Office were streamed on Netflix, right? And it's like, so if we think about like, we're home, we're watching a lot more TV shows, like I'm taking recommendations for TV shows, especially once the weather gets bad, right? Like, and so usually if I turn on a new show or I start a new series, that first impression is my hook, right? That first impression is like, if I start a movie or I start a show and like for the first half an hour of it, I'm just bored out of my mind. I'm like, yeah, maybe I'll see what else is on, right? Like first impression matters. Like grabbing a book, like, you know, we read the beginning of Phuc Tran's book Saigon, and it's like the hook of that book like really grabbed me when I read that for the first time, and I was like, wow, this is something that I know that I want to read, right? And you're going to see the same thing of Trevor Noah's book when we get to it. So the idea is that in writing, like bringing the reader into that first impression, just like meeting somebody for the first time, something like that, can do something really powerful, because if you have the reader's attention, if you pull them into your ideas, then it's easier to be able to hold them there. Now, when I'm reading your essays, I mean, obviously a great hook is nice to have in an essay, but don't worry if your hook's like, I'm not going to be like watching a Netflix show where I'm like, and change the channel, right? Like I'll still give your ideas like the full attention and all that. But I think there's something really cool, and we'll talk about some strategies of how to do that, to be able to grab your reader and pull them into your paper. The other thing that you want to think about that an intro does is it gives your reader context. And so we'll talk about what that means in a few minutes and how to be able to develop that. And that context is really important, because you don't want to just give the reader your thesis statement. You want to prepare the reader for your thesis statement, right? So it would be super weird if all of a sudden I just presented you with my stance on an issue, right? If I were to just be like, all of a sudden we log on to Zoom and I were to be like, I don't know, sheltering in place is a really important practice because it helps keep family members safe. You'd be like, I didn't know we were talking about that, right? Or like if all of a sudden someone just gave you like some, you know, strong argument they were making on whether or not they believed in defunding the police, you'd be like, whoa, I didn't know that we were on that topic. But instead, if someone starts kind of bringing you into that topic, explaining an issue, presenting an issue to you, then them presenting you with their argument on that makes a little bit more sense, right? So it's really, we'll talk about some strategies to be able to do that you need to prepare your reader for your thesis. So you're not just like giving a reader your argument without them fully understanding why the argument is there or why the argument is relevant. And then that thesis, right? And I saw this idea came up. This is kind of one of those ideas that we know to be true in our intro, is that we want to present a thesis, or we'll talk about what a thesis is and how to put one together, or just some central idea, like this is the point that I'm arguing for the rest of my essay. Any questions at all so far? Okay, so yeah.
No, I just said no.
Oh, okay, sorry. All right, so this is a lot easier than I thought it was going to be, with being able to kind of navigate. We've been having meetings where, like, you know, there's like little hands try to go up. I did a webinar last week for like kind of an organization I work for with like training other teachers, and there was like 200 people in there, and I'm like, luckily, like we were able to like control people's microphones and stuff like that. But then like watching my kids' teachers downstairs when it's like all these different voices going crazy, but this is super smooth. If you guys have any questions, just shout them out. Like there's not that many of us. It's really easy to do this. So let's talk about some strategies on hooking your reader. So this idea, like this is kind of what I was talking about pulling the reader into your paper, right? Like being able to grab the reader's attention. And there's some different ways that we can do that. You know, there is no one way to structure an introduction, just like there's not going to be one way to structure an essay, right? Like there's so many different ways of looking at putting an intro together. There's a lot of different ways of looking at putting an essay together. There's no rule of how many paragraphs one has to be or anything like that. But there are structures that are effective, right? So there are ways of doing it where you're like, this isn't necessarily the right way to do it, but it's an effective way to do it. And so I want to make sure that I kind of make that clear over the semester, that I'm showing you what I think are effective ways to put introductions together or effective ways to structure your essay, but it's not the only way to have to be able to do it, right? And so I think it makes sense when you kind of think about the writing process as like, again, going back to this idea of it being recursive, of something where we'll be able to try different strategies over the semester. But there's also, you know, writing your intro as the first paragraph in your essay and starting with the hook and working your way to a thesis. it works well, right? Like it's one of those structures that it's not the only one, but it's a popular one for a reason. So just because I'm talking about a structure this semester, if you think about other ways you might want to think about structuring your essay, we can definitely talk about how to do that and look at some of those. But I think that there's a difference between saying that this is the way you have to do it versus saying that this is an effective way of doing it. So this structure of introduction is not the only way to do it, but I think it's an effective way to do it. So we'll talk more about that and like structure and organization as the semester goes on. But you know, I just want to show you that like, here's a way that I'm showing you this. It's not the only way of doing this. So starting your essay with a hook is a really effective way of starting the essay. And so one of the ways that you can do that is maybe you're starting with some sort of short narrative, right? Like stories are really effective, right? Like if I were to say, hey, let me tell everybody a story, I don't know, if someone's like, oh, I got a great story to tell you, I'm like, oh, I'm really interested, right? Like I want to know the story. I want to follow along with somebody's story. Like people like stories. People are captured by narrative, right? It's why, I don't know, I said that someone watched, that across the country, people watch 25 million minutes of The Office in one day, right? Like it's because people are captivated by stories, right? And so maybe your essay could start with a really quick story. And I saw people already starting to do versions of this in the discussion posts, right? Like they started talking about maybe an important artifact for them was like their family. And they started writing a little bit about like, you know, their family immigrating to the country, or they started sharing information about somebody that was important to them in their family. So just starting with a short little story. Now, this doesn't mean you do like a whole paragraph of a story or a page of a story, but it could be just a few sentences, just enough to hook the reader, just enough to get the reader interested, right? Or maybe kind of bringing up something of what's to come later on in the essay. So just a little quick story is a good way to grab your reader's attention. So this could be a personal story, right? This could be something that's anecdotal, maybe it comes from, you know, anecdotal just means that it's kind of like a story to be able to support an idea. It's not like hardcore, like true proven evidence. But a lot of times when people talk about like anecdotal evidence, right? Like if I were to say, oh, I don't know, like I could say right now, like, I think that, you know, first responders are firefighters are really great people. And you'd be like, oh, well, how come? And I'm like, oh, well, because, you know, when there was the fire, like my house had to be evacuated. Like we ran across some firefighters who were still there. They were really nice to my kids. And I could give you all sorts of anecdotal evidence of why I feel that way, right? So it could be a personal experience. It could be somebody that you know. And then your stories could also maybe come from a news source, someplace like that. But you might want to try starting your essay with a story. I think that's a kind of a cool way to hook the reader. It's totally up to you. You don't have to do all of these, right? Like these are just some suggestions of one of these could work well. And again, your hook, just 2 or 3 sentences, just enough to grab the reader and then kind of pull them into the paper. Another thing that you could do that works pretty well. Yeah, of course. Go ahead.
Is the hook the introduction or is the hook within the introduction?
It's within a good question. It's within the introduction. So everything that I'm talking about right now, this is all part of your intro paragraph. And your intro paragraphs, again, there's no how long does it need to be? And I get asked that question a lot. And the answer is as long as it needs to be. And I know that's one of those like horrible non-answers, but it'll make more sense as we go along. But for now, I'll say like an introduction is probably about a half a page, maybe 3/4 of a page for this essay, right? So everything that I'm talking about right now is all part of the intro paragraph, and I'll show kind of a visualization of the intro at the end that I think will help think about how that paragraph is all put together. So you could ask your reader a question, right? Questions are at the beginning of an essay are usually rhetorical questions, meaning they're not meant for your reader to have an answer. So like, I don't know, if I were to ask like my kids a rhetorical question, if I were to say, hey, do I look stupid to you, right? I really don't want them to answer that question, right? And so that's rhetorical, right? It's just meant them to kind of get them thinking, oh, well, very clearly dad knows what we're up to and we're not going to get over on him, right? And so sometimes like think about, I don't know, if I call one of my friends on the phone, right? Like, and I just pick up the phone and I'm like, especially now, right? Like I'm home and I spend a little bit more time on the phone than I used to talking to friends that I don't get to see as much anymore. Or at all in some cases, right? And so if I were to say like, call them up and be like, what are you up to? Nothing, what are you doing? nothing. Like that's gonna be kind of probably a boring beginning of a conversation, right? But if I start with a quick question and I'm like, I was like, dude, did you hear about what happened to so and so? They'd be like, what? Right? Like they're hooked, right? Like I could grab their attention pretty easily. And so maybe one of the things you can do is like, I don't know, if I thought about this essay, I could start with something just very simple, like, you know, what are one of the things that really motivated you to attend school? And I'm not asking you to tell me your answer, but already your kind of gears are grinding a little bit, right? And you're already kind of thinking about like, what kind of things motivated me? What does it mean to feel motivated? Like, who are the people that motivate you to pursue an education? And already like, you're kind of getting those ideas going. So the purpose of these questions is not as much to get an answer from your reader, because you're not talking to, like, you know, you're not gonna be able to hear my answer. It's not like I read your hook in your essay and then I write you an email and be like, here's my response to your rhetorical question at the beginning of your essay, right? Like, but instead it's just meant to kind of get the reader thinking, right? Get those wheels turning a little bit. So when it comes to hooks, you can also use a quote. So this is a really effective way also to start an introduction. And you can also, I think it can be really effective to use a quote that came from one of our readings, right? So like, let's say maybe, for example, I don't know, there was something that Sherman Alexie or Phuc Tran said that you thought was a really cool idea. You might want to use one of those quotes at the beginning of your essay. Later on, as we move into essays that are going to require you to use quotes from the reading to build your arguments, in those places it's going to be especially effective to use quotation marks. This essay, I'm not requiring that, but in future essays, you will have to use quotes from the reading to back up the claims that you're making. And so when that time comes, you might say, oh, I want to use, you know, a quote from, I don't know, Trevor Noah, or a quote from Adichie, or a quote from whoever we're reading, to be able to back up the claims that we're making, right? And it could be a cool way to pull the reader into the paper, because maybe you think there's an idea that a writer is presenting that really sets the tone for what you're talking about in your essay. You can also use quotes that you find on your own, right? It can be someplace where you're looking through an essay and you can say, oh, I really like this idea, and I think that this idea is something that I want to include in my essay, or it's related to the issue that I'm exploring, right? Maybe you're writing a paper on this case on education and motivation behind education, and you found a quote that you thought was really motivating. That quote could also be one of your artifacts, right? So you can start with it, and then later on you can talk about why that quote is so meaningful to you, right? So it's totally up to you. And I think starting with a quote is a cool way to start a paper. The other thing that you could do is you could use a fact or a statistic, right? Like, this is a really effective way to hook your reader. This semester, we're going to talk about rhetoric, right? And rhetoric is a really important thing to pay attention to. So I'll have, you know, another presentation on rhetoric. There'll be Canvas material. We'll be doing some reading about it, but I just want to talk a little bit about it right now. And rhetoric is the use of persuasive language, right, on purpose. And we're getting ready to, especially right now, like, there's some big things going on in the world, right? We're getting ready to move into an election, and you're constantly being exposed to rhetoric, right? You're constantly being exposed to the language that people are using with intention behind that language. So like, let's say, for example, if I'm watching the news right now, I could hear people being described as protesters, and I could hear people being described as rioters, depending on which news outlet I turn on TV, right? When I say there's a protest happening, your emotions are different than when I say there's a riot happening, right? So depending on which word I choose to use to describe an event can bring out a different emotion in somebody, right? And so I think the idea is that that's rhetoric, right? People are using language on purpose to make their audience feel a certain way. And when you're listening to people's speeches, if you watched any of, you know, I watched a little bit of like the DNC and I watched a little bit of the RNC just to kind of see what's going on, right? When the presidential debates happen, I will watch those 100% for sure. I'll be watching those like people watch the Super Bowl, because I love watching the way that people present the same idea. You can see that if you flip through the news. If you're watching, I don't know, Fox News, and then you watch NBC, and then you watch CNN, and then you watch all these different places, you can watch the same story be covered 2 or 3 different ways. And the language that people are using when they're presenting that story is very, very intentional. It's meant to make a person viewing feel a certain way or believe in something or follow a certain direction. And so when you start a paper, you can give somebody some sort of statistic or some sort of fact that can maybe be really shocking to the reader. And so we saw, Tran did that in the beginning of his prologue. The first thing that he started with was "fuck that kid," and I was like, "Ooh, why is he so upset? Right? What did this poor kid do to him that's all of a sudden making this writer angry?" But even just that little bit of shock that he hit the reader with in the beginning showed the emotion that he had. Already, I knew that Tran was starting his book from a position of being angry, from a position of maybe having some resentment, right? And I was hooked already. And we can see like shocking statistics. If I'm writing a paper about housing, which is an issue we're going to be exploring this semester, and I were to give you a statistic on the number of people who are experiencing housing insecurity in California, maybe that's meant to shock you in the beginning so that I've got your attention and now I can be able to take you someplace. We see the news do that, right? The news starts with the leading story. It starts with the most shocking story because they're going to be able to grab viewers. And so I think that like thinking about a statistic, thinking about a fact, depending on what you're writing about, I don't know if it works as well in this paper. It might, right? But it's a good way to grab the reader, to pull some emotion out of that reader, and to be able to move them in the direction of your argument later on. Any questions at all on hooks? So
Yeah, I had a question.
Yeah,
So is
absolutely.
the hook, like, say you're using a statistic or something, so
Uh-huh.
can a hook be just like 1 or 2 sentences then?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and the statistic would be a great place to do 1 or 2 sentences, right? Like explain what it is, like give the statistics, and then that's enough to be able to pull the reader in and then explain it a little bit more from there. So building context for your reader, right? A main purpose of the introduction is to be able to help your reader build context. There's information your reader needs to be able to understand your argument. This is really, really important to think about. So context is one of those words that, I always say at the beginning of my classes when we're face-to-face that like, I will use the word context hundreds of times over the course of the semester, right? What is context when you think about the meaning of that word context? Anyone have a definition they want to give for context or what context means to them?
I don't know, but I think like the meat of it.
Exactly. That's a really good way of thinking about it. The meat. In fact, like I'm learning sign language. I took sign language classes at Solano, which is a really cool class. If anyone, you need to take a foreign language class for your degree, right? General education. And sign language, the sign for context is this. You kind of grab the meat of your hand. And I think meat is a cool analogy of when you're thinking about what context is. And so context it's really how we make meaning of the world, right? It's how we understand surrounding. Context is just like the general understanding of something. So right now, the context for the school that we're in, let's think about like the way that we're all dressed, right? Like I'm dressed super duper comfortable because of the context of school right now. I wouldn't be wearing what I'm wearing right now if I was at work, right? I think they'd probably send me home. I think my shirt would be okay, but down here I'm wearing like, I have clothes on. Like, don't get worried. But I have like workout shorts on because all you see is my context from here up. And actually last week when I was presenting at a conference online, I was wearing a dress shirt, but I was still wearing this like a same pair of like running shorts, right? I'm also not wearing shoes because for this context, it's no problem. But if I came into work and I wasn't wearing shoes and I had like running shorts on and a t-shirt on, people would be like, maybe Jose's not dressed appropriately for this context. But then also like, let's change the context. Let's change the situation. If we were all going, right? If COVID was over and we could go to big giant weddings again and stuff like that. If we were all at the same wedding and all of a sudden I was wearing this same shirt with like jeans on, people would be like, you're way underdressed for this wedding. But if I was sitting here right now in a suit and tie, you'd be like, man, Jose's a really formal dude, right? Like, so it really just depends on the situation, what kind of clothing makes sense for me to wear, right? And so that's context. And the way that we make meaning of the world is by looking at environment, right? Like if I'm at a park with my kids and there's a dog, like I look at the situation to see if it's safe for the kids to be able to pet the dog, right? Like I'm always making sense of things. When I come into the classroom for the first time, if I'm teaching face to face, the way that people know if I'm the teacher is where I'm standing in the room, right? If I sit down at a desk, then we'd all sit there and wait for someone to show up. If I stand in front of the classroom, then they assume that I'm the person who's teaching the class. So it's all about making meaning from what's around us. And your understanding can change significantly depending on the environment that you're in, right? So like the example that I give about context is I was with my wife at Target and we were looking for a new vacuum cleaner. This is the super exciting life that I used to live before, like when we could still go to stores. And so like we were walking around and I was like looking at those little robot vacuum cleaners that drive around your house. And I was like, oh, this looks cool. And I was talking about why I liked it and blah, blah, blah. And a woman came up and she's like, hey, could you help me when you're done helping her? And I was like, oh, no, I don't work here. But the reason she thought that I worked there is because I was wearing a red polo, right? And so in that context, that made perfect sense. If I was at Best Buy, would she have asked me to help her when I was done talking with my wife about vacuum cleaners?
No,
No. Why not?
because they were blue.
Because they wear blue, right? Because the context changes. So the way that she made meaning from that situation changed, right? And so
Yeah.
that's super important when it comes to reading. It's super important when it comes to writing, is that we make sense of everything by the situation that we're in. And so if we think about that, we need to prepare our readers for our thesis statements. Our introductions have to build context for our reader. So for example, one of the things that we might have to do is we might have to define key terms. So this paper is going to focus on educational artifacts. You should explain to your reader what an educational artifact is. And granted, in this case, I'm probably your main reader, right? When we have face-to-face classes, sometimes we bring in copies of essays and share them with each other. And I might find ways of being able to do versions of that this semester. But for the most part, like, I'm your reader, I'm your target audience. But you always want to pretend that your reader has not read the same things that we've read. You want to be able to pretend that you could pass your paper to somebody in your family, to a friend, to a random person walking by in the hallway if we're still in class together, and that person could read that paper and still understand what we're talking about. And so a lot of times it takes you defining key ideas. It takes you bringing the reader up to speed with the issue that you're exploring in your essay. Okay, so what is a thesis? We talked about this a little bit. How do people define this idea of thesis statement?
Main idea.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's your main idea, right? And we'll hear the word main idea used other places, like in a paragraph, right? But the thesis is the main idea for the essay, right? I think about them as kind of like little like micro and macro ways of looking at things, of kind of like zooming in and zooming out of stuff. So like a main idea is the idea that's in charge of the paragraph. But the thesis statement is the idea that's in charge of the essay. So we think about it as like a paragraph. An easy way to think about the definition of a paragraph is just a group of sentences that are all supporting one idea, right? And if we think about that even smaller, a sentence is a group of words, sometimes just one word, right? But words that are working together to convey one meaning. Paragraph, sentences that are working together to convey one meaning. And an essay is paragraphs that are working together to convey one meaning, right? So if we think about like almost like pecking order, right? Like the main idea is in charge of, in the context of a paragraph, would be kind of like, I don't know, order of like hierarchy and like military or things like that. But that would be like, you know, I don't know, like a commander, like they're in charge of that little group. If I think about it in a family, right? Like maybe that one's like the parent, but then sometimes families have like, I don't know, like in my family, my extended family, like my grandparents are super old, right? Like my grandpa just turned 100 and my grandma's almost 100. And like, but they're like the family patriarchs, right? Like they're the highest in our family. They'd be kind of like the thesis statements. They're in charge of all these other little pieces of smaller family that exist within there. And so same idea, it's a main idea, except for instead of controlling just the paragraph, it controls the whole essay. So it's your purpose, it's your argument behind why you're writing your essay. And we'll talk about this a little bit. Oh, okay. So your thesis statement. Your thesis statement is usually one well-developed sentence, right? But it works okay as just one sentence, because to kind of go off of that question earlier about, is this all part of the introduction? Yes, right? It's so as part of a whole introduction where you have a hook, you build context, right? Then the thesis is totally fine to just be one sentence, because your introduction is not just one sentence, it's more stuff working together. And then by the time you hit that reader with a thesis, one sentence is usually enough, right, to write your thesis. Again, not always true, but I think you write a one sentence thesis statement, totally fine. Usually your thesis is located at the end of your introduction. And the reason why it makes sense to put the thesis at the end of the introduction is because we're working our way up to presenting the thesis statement to the reader, right? And an easy way to think about this is the controlling idea of your essay. It's the point that you're articulating for the rest of the essay. Like, here's the idea that I want my reader to understand, and this is what's going to be responsible for the rest of my essay. Meaning that your body of your essay is meant to fully develop and to support your thesis statement, right? So if we think about that idea of like controlling idea, everything else that comes in the essay is there to support that thing. So think about it like, you know, I'm not going out to eat anymore really in a lot of places, right? Like restaurants are closed, some of them are open, whatever. Like, but so I'm doing a ton of cooking at home, and I cooked a lot before, but now it's like, I cook a lot, right? And so if I think about the controlling idea is the thing that I want to cook. Everything else, like let's say I was going to go to the store and I need to buy stuff to, I don't know, cook something specific for dinner. And I want to say, I'm only going to buy the things that I need to be able to cook this dish. That's the only stuff that I need. This controlling idea is the end goal of what I want to cook. Everything else that I'm buying, everything I'm chopping, everything that I'm boiling or preparing or doing whatever to is there because it's part of this larger meal. So think about like hosting Thanksgiving, right? Like there's a lot that goes in. If you've hosted Thanksgiving before, like it's a lot of work, right? Like, but it's like everything that I buy at the store, everything that I'm prepping the night before. Like, I mean, we start cooking for Thanksgiving like a day and a half early, right? Like I have to say, okay, well, I have to buy salt and I have to buy this and I have to buy that because I have to brine my turkey and I got to do that a day in advance. And I got to, and it's like everything is done with the intention of what's coming later on, right? It's all controlling idea. And your thesis statement works the same way. This is the idea that you want to argue in your paper. Every sentence that you write in your paper is there because that is there to support the thesis statement, right? Just like everything that you take out of the pantry or out of the refrigerator is there because it's part of that thing that you're cooking. And so that's kind of, for me, like been a helpful way to think about it. Yeah.
So I just want to make sure I understand this right. If my artifact is my mom would be my thesis, right?
Yeah. So your thesis would essentially be like, so let's say you found a few different artifacts, because you're going to be like, you would want to have probably like 3 artifacts in this paper to help you develop it. But maybe it's all centered on your mom. Maybe one of those things is a picture of your mom. Maybe one of those things is a piece of advice that your mom gave you. And maybe one of those other things is like, I don't know, a gift your mom gave you or whatever, right? But absolutely, your thesis would be like, you know, my mom is a person who really motivates me, and all of these things that she's given me or artifacts that I have from her have driven me to pursue an education, right? That's the argument that you're making about your mom. Absolutely. And then the other paragraphs will now be, here's, you know, advice my mom gave me. Here's a gift my mom gave me. Here's whatever. And those will all support that idea. Okay. This essay is a little bit like, this is a nice place to kind of cut our teeth on thesis statements, because there's not a way for me to agree or disagree with you on this thesis, right? Later on, your thesis statements and future essays are going to take a much more argumentative standpoint. And we'll talk about that. That's coming up next. So your central point of your argument, like that's where we're going to be going with future thesis statements. This one is just kind of a nice place to get started, where it's like, you could just say, you know, my mom is a constant source of motivation for me pursuing my education. Boom. And now you're going to argue that for the rest of your essay, right? But later on in your essay, your stance, very much so. When we use argument for this class, I don't mean that we're going to be like screaming at each other, but argument as far as like a stance that you're taking. A strongly put together thesis is a statement that somebody could be able to argue and agree with or disagree with, right? So like, let's say, for example, in a future essay, I'm going to be asking you to explore housing in the Bay Area. And what do you think if there are sources of inequity when it comes to housing across the Bay Area? And so when you think about that idea, you could very easily create an argument one way or another on what you believe about that, right? And then somebody who's reading that could say, well, I agree with this writer, or I disagree with this writer, or I don't quite know yet. Your job in this class will never be to change my mind about anything. And also, you know, we're all different people with different opinions on a wide variety of different issues. It's never about whether or not I agree or disagree with an idea, or your reader agrees or disagrees with an idea. It's about, are you creating a sound argument behind your idea? Again, this paper is separate from that, so I'm not going to talk about this a lot, but I will in future essays. So really, I mean, there could be people and ideas that you wholeheartedly disagree with, but you're like, oh, it's a well-developed argument. I don't agree with it, but it's a well-developed argument. Or there could be an idea that you totally agree with, and then you could say, oh, the argument still needs a little bit of a development, right? If someone could say, oh, you know, like someone could say, oh, I love the TV show Last Chance U. If you haven't watched that show yet, it's super good. It's about community college football, and it's actually filmed this season on Netflix in Oakland at Laney Community College. And if you haven't watched it, it's really good, right? And I don't even really like football, but I love the show. But if like someone said, oh, I like that show, I'd be like, well, how come? Oh, it's really good. I'd be like, that's a bad argument. I agree with it, but it's not a well-developed argument. But someone could put together a really well-developed argument about why they hate my favorite restaurant or hate my favorite show. And I could be like, I disagree with your argument, but it's a well-developed argument, right? So don't ever feel like your argument has to be something that I agree or disagree with. It's just about, are you developing your ideas? No, someone just asked the question, Faith wants to know if we only pick one artifact and then base our whole essay around that. No, you should have more than one artifact. There should be used like about 3. But the point that I was making to Amber's question was, if her mom is the center idea of the essay, there could be 3 different artifacts that are focused on their mom. So like, for example, like, let's say I would want to do that with my kids. I could say like, maybe there's a picture, right? Like that I have a picture of my kids in my office. Maybe it's, I don't know, like something that my kids said to me one day, right? And I could find different ways of using 3 different artifacts focused on the same topic. So that's totally up to you. Or they could be 3 totally different things. One could be a picture of my kids. One could be, you know, a piece of advice someone gave me. It could be whatever you want it to be.
So there's no right or wrong, like, way to write.
Nope.
Okay.
No, and there's no, and kind of going back to that point of like your argument, I can't say to you, oh no, that's incorrect. Your mom wasn't inspirational for you for that reason. Like, I can't tell you that, right?
Okay.
But I can say, you need to support this idea with some evidence. I can ask questions like, how did that make you feel? You know, there's no wrong saying, oh, well, it's like my parents were inspirational. Like, you know, my dad finished the 3rd grade before he, you know, wasn't able to go to school anymore in Mexico. So my dad doesn't have any kind of formal education. Well, how does that motivate me to go to school? You can't tell me that it doesn't, but I have to explain to you how it does. Like, me just telling you that is not enough. I have to explain to you how that's a motivating factor for me, right? So it's not about right and wrong. It's about, is the idea developed enough for your reader to understand it? And this is really important to think about, because I don't know your experiences, right? Like, I don't know why that's significant for you. I don't know your stories in a lot of cases. And so you have to explain them, not to me as your teacher, but to me as your reader, right? And then this, I think, is a helpful way to visualize an introduction. I like to think of an introduction like analogous to thinking about it as a funnel, right? When you think about a funnel, the top is really big and wide, and the bottom is really narrow and specific, right? So if we think about that like conceptually for your introduction paragraph, your hook is the most general idea of your essay, right? You start your introduction very general, and then from there, your ideas get more and more specific until the most specific idea is your thesis statement, right? And so if we think about that when you're putting the intro together, think about hook your reader, start general. All this stuff that comes in the middle is building context, getting more and more specific until you get to your thesis, which is the most specific sentence of your introduction, because that's the focus of the rest of your essay. What we want to be careful of is you don't want your thesis to be super general, right? You don't want to just be like, you know, I don't know, there's stuff that motivated me to go to school. Like, not quite enough, right? But maybe you're a little more specific there to kind of get down into this, here's this controlling idea that I want my reader to understand for the rest of the essay. So I had this explained to me when I was in English 1 class when I was at Solano, that the teacher was like, think of it like a funnel. And I was like, oh, it's always been really helpful, right? Like more and more specific until the end of the introduction is the specific central argument that you want the reader to understand. Any questions at all about putting an intro together? So I think what that means for this paper then is what I want you to just start practicing, to what you'd be turning in on by Sunday is your intro, is just think about, give me the context that I need, like hook me a little bit, get me thinking about school, what's motivating you. It could be like what you're choosing to study. Like this essay is done for a couple things. One, it really gives me a chance to kind of get to know you all. It's a little bit more of a personal essay than maybe some of our other essays will be. And then also it kind of gives me an idea to see where people are in the writing process, right? Like kind of some of the stuff that we're going to be continuing to build on. One of the things that you'll see that I'll do over the semester is a lot of the stuff that I'm doing in the class. I mean, obviously we have the things that we're covering, the assignments we're going to be doing, and I have a good roadmap of where all of that is. But a lot of the other stuff that we're doing over the semester is kind of like triage or reactionary, meaning that like as things start to present themselves that I see in people's writing or things that we need to continue to work on, I'll start introducing more of those things as we go along. So I kind of going back to the idea of like the backwards design, right? Like I know the different things that I want to focus on for the semester. I know the assignments that we're doing to get us there. But as far as like, in week 6, are we going to be working on quote integration, or are we going to be doing a little bit more of that in week 7? Like that all really kind of depends on the things that we're doing in the class and the things that I'm seeing in the writing. So it's really about like adding some of the fine-tuning structure for what we need specifically, right? Like, and so if there's times where, like for this essay, as I start to see things that are coming out in people's writing, it just kind of gives me a good opportunity to like see where you all are. And next week I'll talk about body paragraphs. I'm planning on doing, and I'll advertise it as well, another little mini lesson on next Thursday, because we don't have school on Monday, on just like body paragraphs. And so I'll talk a little bit about like kind of putting together a body paragraph for this paper. So right now I just want you to worry about just give writing the introduction a try, right? Like build some context for me, bring me up to speed with the issue. Maybe you're talking about why you're going to school, and then start diving into like that argument on what's motivating you to do it. And then next week, what we'll do is we'll start talking about how we build those body paragraphs out to show that motivation. Any questions for me at all?
Yeah, I just want to ask, so if I have like a bunch of main ideas that I want to put in each paragraph,
Mm-hmm.
Is it right or wrong to put those ideas in my introduction, or does it not matter? I mean,
It's totally
for
up to
any
you.
essay.
So there's no right or wrong behind that. It depends on the person. Sometimes it depends on the reader, what the individual reader likes. Sometimes it depends on what the essay is focusing on. So I would say a lot of times I don't think you need to list all of the different things. And the reason is because like if we think about, like, let's say I'm creating an argument. If I were to say that I think there are several factors that are creating inequitable housing market in California, right? Like let's say that's the argument that I want to create in an essay. you know that I'm going to be exploring those factors later on in my body paragraphs. But if I say there's several factors that are creating an inequitable housing market in California, they are overpriced homes, underpaying jobs, and lack of available real estate. Well, I could do that too. It's totally okay. But I think it's a little bit repetitive, because the very first thing, if I say, there are many reasons why I feel this way, A, B, and C, what's the very first thing that I'm going to talk about after I say A, B, and C? A, right? So it's almost like I'm repeating myself a little bit. So it's totally okay to do, but it really depends on what you're doing, right? And it really depends on the situation, and it depends on I don't know, what you want to write at that time. So it's not about right and wrong. It's just about what's appropriate when and where. I will talk with you guys later on in the semester about different coherence techniques. So there's actually strategies that you can use at the beginning of paragraphs. And one of those strategies is what's called repetition of key terms, where in your introduction, you give ideas that are key ideas that when you hear those ideas used again, it instantly brings you back to the thesis statement. Repeating those big ideas from the thesis statement is a coherence strategy. And we'll talk about what those mean, which is basically a way of making your ideas stick together. And by doing that, you kind of accomplish that same thing in a little bit more of a sophisticated way. So by all means, you can totally do that. And some instructors really love that and some don't. And I don't care either way, right? But I'm going to show you different strategies. And so what I would say is, like, try it on one paper, try it in a different way. And again, it's all about, like, the way I like to think about it is like to think about, like, I'm going to show you, my goal over the semester is give you like kind of a tool bag of how to be able to put together writing an essay, right? That there's so many different ways of doing it. There's different tools when it comes to doing academic reading. There's different tools when it comes to writing an essay. And it's not about like this holding up an individual tool and saying, is a screwdriver a good or a bad tool? Well, my answer would be like, it depends what job you're trying to get done, right? And so it's like, think about processes that you know very, very well, right? Like if I go back to my idea of cooking, right? Like, I don't toot my own horn, but like there's certain things that I know that I can cook really well, right? And one of those things that I feel like, and you know, if you're vegetarian or vegan like my brother, I apologize, but like one of the things that I know that I cook well is steak. Like I'm pretty good at cooking steak, but I can do it, I don't know, several different ways. There's no right and wrong answer. If I were to say, well, what's better? Do I put it on my smoker and then do I sear it on my barbecue? Sure. Do I put it on my smoker and do I sear it in a pan? Fine. Do I sous vide it? Sure. Do I cook it all in the pan? Sure, right? Like there's no right and wrong. There's just a bunch of different ways of doing it. It's just all about like, which one do I want to do more? Sometimes it takes 4 hours. Sometimes it takes 5 minutes, right? It's all about context. It's all about which one is best when. And so I would say try it, right? Try different things. And I think that's true for everybody, like to kind of think about like, you're in a situation in this class where like, it's low stakes, right? Like we do the writing, we practice it, we see what works, we have chances to revise our papers, turn them in again for different grades if we want to, right? Like, so don't even worry about like, I'm trying this right now, maybe it works okay. And, you know, kind of going back to that example of food, sometimes I cook things, I'm like, this is not great, but I can always order pizza if I need to, if I mess up dinner, right? And so it's that same idea with like, give things a shot. It's low stakes context, right? Like we're not like this whole, like, if I get it wrong, it's the end of the world, because we can work on it next time. Any other questions? Cool. So I will post this on Canvas. People will have access to it. And if you wanted to look at it, or people who weren't here. And then if anyone wants to stick around who has any specific questions, I'm in my office hour for another hour. Thanks for stopping by. It was nice seeing some faces of people. And then, like I said, if you want to hang out and have any questions, I'm still going to be in the Zoom meeting.